What's good, YouTubes? Steph here, and welcome to Theta Space. Today I'm picking out 10 of my favorite albums. As I said at the top, these are 10 of my favorite albums, not my 10 favorite albums of all time. Some of them certainly are among my 10 favorite albums of all time. But because I set a limit of just one album per artist, that made room for some of the lower ranks to move up into the top 10. I'll mention the records that fell to this rule as I go along. And also, while I will be listing my top favorites earlier than later, this is going to be a more or less arbitrary order, not really a ranking as such. So I'll start with Metal Church, released in 1984. For my money, this was the finest metal album of the 80s. It doesn't have the progginess of Fate's Warning or even Iron Maiden, but it's the best at being just solid, straight-ahead metal. I put this album far above anything Metallica ever did. I actually saw them open for Metallica on the Puppets tour with Jason Newsted on the last night of the tour in Seattle. That was a great show. Anyway, this album just knocks, especially with Beyond the Black, Metal Church, Battalions, In the Blood, and that awesome cover of Highway Star. There's only a couple of songs on the next album, The Dark, that rise up to the level of this record. This is on my short list of perfect albums. Next, Voivod, Nothing Face, another prime metal record. I mean, seriously, who could have predicted a record like this from the same band that made War and Pain in 1984? This is the album with the first Pink Floyd cover, Syd Barrett's Astronomy Domine, but to me the standouts are Missing Sequences, Pre-Ignition, and especially Into My Hypercube. But like the Metal Church debut, this album is solid from front to back with no skip tracks. Echolin, May, 2002. Jethro Tull might have been the first to release a single song that filled an album, but for my money, Echolin did it best with May. This is the band at the top of their game, and the piece never gets boring, and despite the varying movements it goes through, it never gets to sound like a bunch of discrete songs that just segue one to the next. It really does hang together as a large-scale composition. They also played a great live performance of it on the Stars and Gardens live DVD. 1974's Relayer by Yes. If I weren't limiting myself to one album per artist, Close to the Edge would be here too. But Relayer just edges it out for having my favorite Yes epic, The Gates of Delirium, and the two other tracks are great too. Kenso's entry on this list is Sparta, 1989. If you saw my ranking of the 9 studio albums by this Japanese prog fusion band, you already know they're one of my favorite groups and that I think very highly of this album. Kenso 3 and Fabulous Mirabilibus Bombicosi Scriptus would probably make the cut if I weren't imposing the one album rule. My favorite Kenso track, Bifuka, lives on this one, and all the other tracks range from great to pretty good. And U Totem, released in 1990, the self-titled. Not every track on this album's a winner, but it makes the list on the strength of One Nail Draws Another, one of the most amazing compositions that I've ever heard. Vagabond's Home and the Judas Goat raised this album's score also, and there are no bad tracks here. There's just a couple that aren't in the same division as the best tracks. Next, Pink Floyd, The Dark Side of the Moon from 1973. Really, what can I say about this album that hasn't been said already? I would have Animals and Wish You Were Here on the list as well, but if I have to pick just one, it's this classic. It's an album that really demands to be played all the way through, and it's Alan Parsons' engineering that puts it at the top. Also, David Gilmour's solo on Time is my favorite guitar solo ever by anyone. Then Dream Theater, Awake, 1994. It's the first Dream Theater album that I ever heard in 1999, and the last one to feature what I consider the best lineup with both James LaBrie and Kevin Moore. It's another flawless record with no skip tracks, opens strong with 6 O'Clock, and my favorite Dream Theater song, Scarred, is here, as well as the incredibly morose Space Dive Vest, which is basically a Kevin Moore track covered by Dream Theater. I've done a trance remix of it, by the way. I was working on just a cover of it with my own vocal, but then somebody gave me LaBrie's isolated vocal, and that's when I made a trance remix. Passion Play, Jethro Tull, 1973, another basically single composition that fills the whole album. I mentioned Thick as a Brick earlier, and I like it, but overall, I prefer this follow-up album. Lyrically, musically, and conceptually, I think it improves on Thick as a Brick in every way. Most of the instrumental passages are just brilliant, and in particular the one between The Foot of Our Stairs and Overseer Overture is my absolute favorite thing that Tull ever recorded. The only thing that really drags it down is the story of the hare who lost his spectacles. It's just goofy and silly, and it doesn't fit with the theme of the album. I mean, I know it's supposed to be an intermission or interval, as the Brits call it, between the first and second half of the play that this album is presented as, but I can do without it. My CD copy is an old release with just a single 45-minute track on it. While I haven't gone so far as to burn and edit without the story of the hare, I have made a copy separating it into a skippable track that I don't have to hear again. And the last one on my list is The Case of the Three-Sided Dream in Audio Color, made in 1975 by Rahsaan Roland Kirk. I thank my dad for a lot of the music I'm into. I believe I've mentioned Pink Floyd and Little Feat already in earlier videos, but he was really big on jazz and blues, and he had a lot of old records, and one of my favorite jazz players that he put me onto was Rahsaan Roland Kirk, who played a lot of instruments, but mostly sax and flute, and sometimes he would play 3 horns at once, or duets with himself on the flute and nose flute. In spite of all that spectacle, he could also take a tenor sax and just play the piss out of it. Kirk was also the man who inspired Ian Anderson to make the flute a big part of Jethro Tull's sound, and in fact Anderson included a cover of Kirk's own Serenade to a Cuckoo on the first Tull record. This album was originally released as a double vinyl LP, sort of a concept piece that opens and closes with a pair of skits called Conversation. It's the Three-Sided Dream because on the double LP set, the album takes up the first 3 sides. The last side seems to be 12.5 minutes of blank silence, but near the end, at about 11 minutes and 15 seconds in, there's a hidden track containing a telephone conversation.
Right Moments.
Right Moments. Hey, Rahsaan.
Yeah.
Do you have a message for the people who'll be listening to the part of the record that no one will be listening to?
Oh, yes, cousin. Yes.
Well, let's have it.
I never heard it on my dad's tape cassette copy that I bought for him. I just thought there was a long silence on the second side, bunch of blank tape. Never knew the hidden track was there until my best friend in college told me it was on the CD, on his CD copy of the album. With 2 exceptions, most of the titles on this album appear twice. For example, Joplin's The Entertainer is done slow and bluesy the first time and fast and energetic the second time. And the lead on Portrait of Those Beautiful Ladies, a Kirk composition, is played on flute in the first version and tenor sax in the second. And there's also a bunch of short audio collages, or musique concrète, all titled Dream, interspersed with the songs. And that's 10 of my favorite albums. I might sort of revisit this in the future with what I consider perfect albums, with no filler or skip tracks, and at least a couple of the albums I listed here would reappear on a list like that, but it wouldn't be the same list, so I think it's worth considering. What would you say are the best albums ever recorded, or just your favorite albums? Let me know in the comments. Also, smash like if you up, and click subscribe. It doesn't cost anything. I'll be back Saturday and Wednesday after that. Until then, bright moments. Steph out.